Okay, hello everybody. Welcome again to the Eurodoc Open Science Ambassador Training. My name is Gareth O'Neill. I'm the president of Eurodoc, and today we're going to have webinar number 4 on open peer review with Jon Tennant. Jon, thanks for coming. I'm going to just quickly give a short introduction, and then I'm going to go straight to you, Jon. Let me pull this up. Okay, so basically the idea behind this ambassador training is that we essentially at Eurodoc have a number of open science ambassadors at our national associations to answer questions related to open science and to also engage many projects on open science and also many policymakers. And we will be opening this course to everybody afterwards, so anybody can follow through all the modules, watch all the webinars, and if they want to also get a certificate to be an ambassador wherever they are. Eurodoc, this is a non-profit organization. We are based in Brussels. We've been actively, legally working for the last 16 years, but as a network much longer, maybe 20, 30 years. And we are funded exclusively for and run by early career researchers in all of our member countries. We basically come together, discuss all policies. We develop them in working groups and at events and in different workshops. And then we engage our stakeholders at a national level in each of our countries, and also the European level with, for instance, the European Commission or Science Europe or the European University Association. We've identified 3 main issues for early career researchers that we find important. The first one is the need for career development, specifically training early career researchers for the non-academic labour market. We know that the majority of early career researchers need to leave academia and work outside. And unfortunately, when we do surveys, we see that they're not being trained, supported, or networked to do this. So this is something that needs to change. Second thing is the rise of mental health issues, and rather not the rise of mental health issues, but the rise of studies on mental health in academia, as this has been a taboo for many years. So we see that many doctoral candidates and postdoctoral researchers are anxious and stressed, and in quite large quantities even clinically depressed, or at least showing signs of clinical depression. So this is something that we need to address also. And the final thing is the rise of open science. Now, open science we've been doing for over 400 years. So when I say open science here, I mean specifically open science within the European policy framework. So basically, this is from around 2016. It's been really solidified by Carlos Moedas, Commissioner at Directorate General for Research and Innovation. And they come out with what they call the 3 O's. So open science, this is basically opening up research using digital tools. Then this is linked to open innovation. So using the outputs of research and collaborating with industry and other stakeholders to drive innovation and create new products and services, particularly digitally. And then this is further linked to what we call open to the world. So how we pull in other societal actors in the research and innovation process, and how we open up what we do, not only to the European market, but also outside, and we pull everybody in on a global scale. Now, what is open science? Basically, we'll hear about that across the webinars, and we'll hear about open peer review today, but it's an umbrella of many practices that are linked to open. And you can think of open access to research publications, or open data, or open education, or even open source or citizen science. So quite a lot of different practices here. Now, why should we do this? Why should we be open? Well, it opens up obvious access to research. By doing that, it increases the discoverability of your results, and it increases your own academic and social impact by doing so. It also helps to facilitate reproducibility and replicability. And for those institutions or researchers who have limited resources, it helps to pool and actually share these resources so that we can work together. And basically, all of this helps to speed up the research and innovation process. And just that I note here, when we say open, we do not mean black and white open versus closed, but we mean a gradual spectrum of open. So there can be levels of open, as in you may not open immediately. There could be some delay to open up research or research data, but also you may not have full, complete access to everything either. Sometimes there are reasons to lock in data, for instance, for military, national security, privacy, or even confidential reasons. And just finally, Eurodoc fully supports open science, specifically open access and fair data. And we ask institutions to train, support, and start rewarding researchers for doing open science. And for those of you who are interested in learning more, not just from our own ambassador training, but you can also visit the Foster website, the links are there, and you can also visit the Open Science MOOC. So I'm going to give the floor to Jon. Jon is the founder of the Open Science MOOC. And Jon, I'm going to let you introduce yourself further and talk a bit about the Open Science MOOC as well.
All right, cool. Thanks for that, Gareth, and thanks for the completely non-obvious plug for the Open Science MOOC. So give me 1 second, I'm just going to share my screen, and then we can get going. I was doing that thing. Cool. Yeah, so hi everyone, thanks for being here. So my name's Jon. I'm an independent researcher. I finished my PhD about 2 years ago now, where I was a paleontologist of all things. But now I work on all sort of matters to do with, what we call open science or open scholarly communication, including the Open Science MOOC, as Gareth mentioned. Today, though, we're going to take a crash course, though, on open peer review as part of this cool training program which we're doing. So this is going to be like, I think, 25 minutes just me rambling about this, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So I'm going to start by taking inspiration from one of the heroes who inspires me in my everyday life, Hermione Granger, the heroine of the Harry Potter series. And one of the reasons why Hermione was such a fantastic character and the most powerful one within the Harry Potter series and the Harry Potter novels was because she understood things about cultural change and history. So one of the first bits of insight we get into Hermione is that she's one of the best witches out there because she has read all about the history of Hogwarts. And it's the same sort of for peer review too. Like if we want to understand the present state of peer review and also the future of it and how open peer review intersects with that, we first have to go through its history a little bit. And this is something which I only discovered maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I began looking into the history of peer review and open scholarly communication and publishing. But it's really eye-opening just to sort of realize, to sort of situate where we are in a wider historical context. So peer review is perhaps not as old as we might think. As Gareth was saying, we've had open science in one form or another for about 400 years. We've had a system of scholarship for decades, not decades, for millennia now, going back, to the ancient Greeks and earliest Egyptians. Peer review, though, in the sort of sense that we might understand it now, only became a thing maybe in the early 19th century. This sort of formalized practice, and it began within learned societies, these sort of gentlemanly scholarly groups, mostly in Western Europe and the UK. And they were focused largely around learned societies, so in particular the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris and the Royal Society in London. And what they both began to do was establish journals to communicate their findings, their discussions much more easily. But back when journals started to become a thing, peer review wasn't really there. Occasionally, the editors of these journals would send out letters for a comment or something from someone else, but there was no such thing really as peer review in the way that we might understand it now. In the sort of post-World War II decades, peer review really began to evolve, though, to become something which we might recognize much more closely today. So this editorial sort of stimulated process became much more sort of generalized, but it happened in a very sort of fragmented way. Peer review sort of spread across communities and across disciplines and across journals in a very haphazard way. It was very non-structural. And yeah, even journals such as Nature, for example, one of the top journals which we have, didn't institute like a formalized process of peer review until the mid-1960s. And with this, there were several sort of related things which happened. So the institutionalization of the process took place mostly in the 20th century, along with the blossoming of many new sort of academies, not just around Europe, but the rest of the world. And with this, we saw an explosion in the number of research groups, the cross pollination of different research disciplines and much more interdisciplinary research coming out there. And all of this led to an explosion in the number of articles being submitted and shared. And because of this sort of exponential growth in the communication of research, there was a new demand for a way to filter that. And this is in a pre-digital age, remember, where journals were there. So there was sort of two ways to do this. One was to increase the number of journals, which happened, There was an explosive growth in the number of journals, and the second one was to put in a filtering system in place. And peer review evolved to become this way for journals to handle the increasing capacity of submissions they were getting. But as well as that, it worked in sync with this sort of neoliberalization of research, again, particularly in Western Europe, where there was now a new demand for expert authority and objectivity within this increasingly specialized world. And because of this sort of this synchronicity with peer review, with authority and objectivity, what happened was it began to be synonymized with value. And as soon as you start to inject value into a system, then you open up different ways to exploit it. And this is how we led to the commercialization of journals and of peer review in this sense, and the incredible growth of companies, the large publishing houses which we know today. And so, yeah, peer review has become this sort of awkward sort of process that, everyone sort of knows is a bit rubbish, but also no one really wants to criticize. It has many features which are resemblant of a sacred cow. We've put it up on this pedestal. But the fact is, often it remains driven by publishers and journals which have commercial interests that are divergent from our own interests as researchers. Often it's anonymous, it's closed, it's exclusive, it's biased, it's subjective. All of these sorts of criticisms are levied at peer review on an almost daily basis. As well as this, it's also extremely time consuming. Like, even I spent the last couple of days doing peer reviews all day for virtually no reward, and it was extremely draining. And it's also an extremely expensive process to manage. It costs about $2 billion a year to maintain this present system of journal-coupled peer review. And yet no one really has any understanding of what it does, whether it actually increases the quality of the research record, whether it increases reliability, its validity, and all of these things. So there are a lot of sort of questions around peer review. And honestly, I think one of the big problems is that a lot of academics don't really understand what peer review is. So like I mentioned, we have this incredibly complex history of peer review where it wasn't always as it is today. But if you speak to a lot of academics, they have this sort of myth embedded into their minds that, hasn't it always been this way? Hasn't peer review and publishing always happened like this? There's this failure to understand the distinction between this ideology, the ideology being that peer review is this magic filter that creates a dichotomy between bad science and good science, and the actual process where we actually have very little insight into the process, because there's very little actual evidence out there about how peer review actually works as a functional process. And it's an incredibly diverse process. Like, peer review is not just one thing. There are a number of different elements, different communities adopt it in different ways, different journals adopt it in different ways, and peer review is a ridiculously diverse process, and we need to appreciate that. Because what we have at the moment, combined with this diversity and this general lack of evidence, is a very fragmented understanding of what peer review actually does and what it's actually for. And because of this, what people have realized in the last sort of 10 years or so is that there's an incredible potential scope for systemic peer review reform. And because of this, things are actually evolving very fast now, often without researchers having full time to adapt or to engage with these changes. But peer review, like I said, it's become sort of institutionalized. It's this sacred cow that people don't really want to touch. If you are seen to question peer review and its efficacy, you're seen almost to question scientific legitimacy and authority. And even just questioning peer review, for example, saying we need to move to a system of open peer review, can be met with an incredible amount of resistance, especially from the entrenched sort of academics in this system. And the reason, again, for this is because of this entrenchment of the process and the fact that peer review has become synonymous with quality. So what we know is that, a lot of researchers will say they will not cite something if it's not peer reviewed, but they will also cite something if it has been peer reviewed without the sort of proper scientific inquiry that we would expect. So peer review has this sort of strange effect on how people perceive the quality of research. But this happens in spite of the lack of evidence supporting the sort of general system of peer review and how it actually works. And yet it defines everything in academia. So we all know about this sort of publish or perish mentality. And the fact is that if you're a master's student or a graduate student, getting that first peer-reviewed article accepted by a journal is, the sort of beginning of your scientific legitimacy as an individual. And the entire hierarchy of our institutes is based often on the number of peer-reviewed papers which you have published. So it's very important despite the fact that we don't really understand it. And it's because, again, like there are these myths that journals and peer review belong together and that they have always been this way. And there's a parasitic industry which gets about 10 billion US dollars a year by relying on perpetuating these myths, and also, we don't really have a chance to disrupt it because of this. So in the last 7 or 8 years, there's been this explosion in what we'll call, open peer review. So this image on the left or right, depending on which way you're looking at this, shows just a number of innovations in peer review which have been developed in the last 7 or 8 years now. And a lot of these are simply web-based tools that do something to peer review. For example, allow post-publication peer review or open commenting, or some way of extending the process from this journal-coupled system into something which is a little bit more diverse based on the power of web technologies. However, most of these tools have been developed around a journal or an article-based system, so they're still very discretized in how they operate, and they also therefore depend on publishers and journals for sustenance. And as a consequence of this, many of them feel like they were sort of plasters to stick over a gaping wound, and there was very little thought into truly alternative systems of a long-term sustainability of these organizations or these companies, as well as the social aspects that were governing peer review practices. And I think, like I just said, what people are trying to do is find technological solutions to social problems. And because they fail to understand that this doesn't really work very well in a lot of cases, a lot of these organizations sadly have collapsed. It's the way a lot of startups go these times. They're all saying that they're going to magically resolve peer review and all of its problems, and then they launch, and then 2 years later, no one uses them, so they collapse and die. But there are a lot of very successful ones in this space, for example, and this is based around this whole idea that with the power of the internet, it is now eminently easy to publish first and, I said perish later, or peer review later. So publish, then review. So for example, if you're in the life sciences, there's a platform out there called F1000 Research. This essentially operates a bit like a sort of mega journal in some respects. It's open access. What they do is they make papers available first, which are essentially preprints, so non-peer reviewed. We just don't call them preprints. And then they invite post-publication peer review later on. And they do this through an editorially controlled process very similar to other journals. But what they do is they publish all of the review reports, they publish the identities of the reviewers, and they create a very simple system of overlay. So they take advantage of version control, the fact that you can just simply upload a new version on top of an old version after it's gone through sequential rounds of continuous peer review. And as well as that, they invite open commenting systems. There are a number of other companies such as PubPeer, PaperHive, and Science Open. And what these allow researchers to do is to go to either preprints or to peer-reviewed journal articles and continue to comment and review them as part of this sort of continuous process. A really sort of exciting new space at the moment. So there's a bit of a preprint revolution happening right now. So the real preprint revolution happened in about 1991. In fact, what many people probably don't know is that the reason why the World Wide Web was built or developed at CERN was for the instantaneous sharing of research articles and data. And this centralized around the platform called the Archive, the first sort of hub of knowledge on the entire World Wide Web. That was why it was built, for sharing of preprints in the physics and computer science and mathematics. And now people have realized actually this is a pretty effective way of communicating research. It's very low cost. And it's possible to overlay peer review on top of these and have communities to manage them. And they call these overleaf journals, overlay journals. And with this sort of exponential growth in preprints at the moment, particularly in the life sciences, there's a lot of new services coming up around these, and they're very interesting. And it's a very sort of exciting space for the sort of open post-publication peer review at the moment. But, as many of you have probably noticed, I've used open peer review to mean a number of different things in the last sort of 10, 15 minutes. And there is a lot of confusion here. So a couple of years ago, someone did a systematic review of what open peer review actually means. And what they found was that there were more than something like 120 conflicting and overlapping definitions of open peer review, but that you could distill down into 7 core traits. And this is really, really important to get right, because often when people are talking about open peer review, they'll be talking about something very different to what other people might understand open peer review is, and we can end up talking past each other rather than talking about the same things. So for example, often when people are talking about opening up peer review reports, it gets a lot of resistance because people say you can't publish people's identities alongside review reports because that would compromise the anonymity of the process. But that's a different factor of open peer review. So we have these 7 sort of core traits, and I'll just go through them because it's important to get this right, I think. The first one, which is one of the main ones which is discussed at the moment, is this idea around open identification. So this is where both the authors and the reviewers are reciprocally aware of each other's identity, either during or after the review process, typically during. The next one, which is, so these are sort of the 2 main ones in the space that are being discussed, is whether or not to open up review reports themselves. So review reports being published alongside the relevant article. So anyone who's ever done a peer review or has had one done on one of their articles will know that there's a lot of critical discussion contained within these review reports, and by unlocking them, you can, first of all, use them for things like educational purposes. You can use them to gain insight into the knowledge which was contained within those reports, and you can also assess the legitimacy of the review process for a particular article. And this is a really, really great way to essentially very easily demarcate between legitimate and non-legitimate journals. So, for example, whether or not a journal actually performs high-quality peer review. And if that entire process is concealed, then you can't distinguish between them. So if anyone's heard of predatory publishers, simply having journals publish peer review reports, whether or not they're anonymous or not, is a great way to expose whether or not a journal is legitimate or not, or predatory or not. The third trait is around open participation. This is simply about enabling the wider community to contribute to the review process, rather than just having 1 or 2 people as part of a behind-the-scenes process. Everyone is invited to contribute, either before or after publication, or as part of a continuous process. The fourth one, is open interaction. So this is where the direct and reciprocal discussion between the authors and reviewers is allowed and encouraged. So rather than just being a sort of discretized set of reports, a very sort of unidirectional process, it's more interactive, like a sort of forum style. The fifth one is about open pre-review manuscripts. So this is very similar to preprints and F1000 that I mentioned before. It's where manuscripts are made immediately available via, things like preprint servers in advance of any formal peer review procedures, typically. And by formal, what is meant here is those embedded within journals. And then as well as that, we have open final version commenting. And this is where review or commenting on the final version of record to the final published article happens. So for example, at platforms like PubPeer or Science Open. And then the final one is this idea of open platforms or decoupled review. So there are a couple of organizations which do this, where a different organization will manage the peer review process for you as part of like an independent process, and then you can use that to submit the article to a journal and say, hey, look, this has already been peer reviewed, therefore can we make the process easier in some way? So these are the sort of different flavors of peer review, the different aspects, the sort of key elements that you need to be aware of in this space. So I mentioned, technology is not the only thing here. So attitudes towards open peer review is a really important thing to look at. So this is from a very large-scale survey, again done by Tony Ross-Hallower, and he looked at changing attitudes towards these different 7 sort of flavors of open peer review. And what you can see with this image is basically blue is favorable towards these different elements of open review, and this beigey, orangey color is not very favorable. So just to draw on a couple of examples, what we can see is that generally researchers are favorable towards the open interaction and having peer review reports published alongside journal manuscripts. These are things that are perceived to be good elements of open peer review. However, if we go to the bottom of this figure, what we can see is that, in fact, people are still quite resistant to the idea of having the reviewers and the authors reveal to each other. And this is an important thing because, again, like I said, if we're talking about different elements of peer review, we're going to meet either support or resistance depending on which element we're talking about. And this element of open identification is not something to be sort of shrugged away at. And this is something which a lot of people are working on right now, trying to understand why this exists. And for early career researchers, typically what it is an early career researcher, if they're going to be heavily criticizing a senior author during the review process, they don't want to have their name associated with that for fear of backlash. So this is a wide cultural problem, again, where we have these insane power dynamics where it's perfectly okay for a senior researcher to punish a junior researcher just for doing their job. And we haven't overcome that yet, but it's a very important thing to consider within these evolving discussions around open peer review. So I'll finish just by addressing some of the sort of major future challenges in this space. So at the moment, catalyzing wider discussion, education, which is, I guess, why you're all here, as well as innovation in peer review. Scientists like to have evidence, so being able to demonstrate that these new practices and processes and tools actually outperform traditional processes or not. So there's a lot of sort of meta research going into this right now. It's a very blossoming scene, but honestly, we really don't know what sort of effect these new models of peer review are going to be having at the moment. The research, like I said, is too fragmented, and we need to have research because people like to make opinions based on evidence. Also, like I mentioned, peer review is a very diverse process across a lot of different journals and a lot of different communities. And if we're going to move forward as a system, then we need to agree on social and technical interoperability requirements across all the different stakeholder groups and communities. And as well as this, enable the sort of different elements of new open peer review systems to be adopted piece by piece across specific communities in a manner where, based on the best available evidence to them at a particular point in time. I think one which is particularly useful for early career researchers is increasing the role of peer review in research evaluation processes. So, if you're a junior researcher and you're spending 1 day every 2 weeks doing peer review or something for a journal, and you're not getting any recognition for that, but it's eating into your research time, you want to find a way to sort of incentivize that better or get better recognition for it. And this is, again, something which is exploding a lot in this space at the moment, trying to find a way to make sure that researchers are effectively rewarded, not necessarily in terms of money, but for their work as reviewers. And something which I'm particularly sort of keen on is looking at how can we embrace the power of Web 0.2 or social communication or social networking technologies, and how can we bind different traits of different platforms into novel peer review models where we leverage the power of social networks to overcome these sort of social tensions. And for this last one, I guess, is mostly for tech developers. It's just overcoming the "if you build it, they will come" fallacy, where people think that they have the technological solution, which is going to resolve peer review, and then two years later they're bankrupt. Yeah, and as we saw with the chart before, this is a little bit of a problem, and people just need to have a greater understanding of the social and cultural aspects of peer review. And again, this is something which is not really easy to get hold of instantaneously. With that, I've got a slide here. I think Gareth will share these. I've got some slides with some of the critical reading in this space, the further reading for you all, because we all have time to be reading all of this stuff. And with that, I think I can pass it back to Gareth, if I can figure it out.
I see. So I'm one or two clarifications to start off. The first thing is a preprint platform the same as an open peer review platform?
Well, it's such a horrible question to start with. No. So, for example, the archive is the archetypal peer review platform, but the only thing which that has on it is preprints and in some cases peer-reviewed manuscripts. And there is a commenting system on archive and a lot of the other sort of newer services coming about. So they're more like platforms that do preprints and do some elements of open commenting. But again, to associate that with the formalized journal coupled process is a little bit of a sort of difficult one to get around at the moment. But like I said, there's a lot of innovation in the space. Yeah, so preprints are only really beginning to take off, in life sciences in particular. So people are beginning to experiment with new models around how they can decouple peer review and the reports themselves, and the articles themselves from journals and from publishers to see if we can do these things more efficiently. I think you've frozen, or I've frozen.
That leads me to the next question. So I'll try this again. So that links me to the next question, which is, you can hear me, good. So there is no preprint server in my field, which is linguistics. Could I just go and create a new preprint myself, or with other individuals? What support is there?
So that's a really good question. So in the last 2 years, there have been an explosion in the number of discipline-specific preprint servers out there. This has mostly been catalyzed by the Open Science Framework, and they have ones for a number of different fields now, including social sciences, which I guess covers linguistics. So I know a lot of linguist colleagues who use either SSRN, if you like Elsevier, or Social Archive, or SOC Archive for sharing their work. There's also, I believe, in linguistics, isn't there a platform called LingBuzz, which is where people have been sharing their preprints for a very long time now. And it's one of the most popular platforms, I think, in linguistics research. I'm really hoping that you said linguistics now, otherwise I'm just rambling. But
yeah, no,
if there is not a suitable platform out there for you, you have two options. So there are a number of multidisciplinary platforms out there. So for example, Zenodo is one which is like an open source non-for-profit hosted by CERN, and they allow you to share any article that you want, or anything more. You also have places like Figshare, and then you have the generic open science framework preprint service as well. But if that's not enough, and you really want to sort of make a little bit of a noise within your community, you can go and message the open science framework, and you can say, hey, I want to set up my own preprint server. And they will say, cool. And you'll go through a couple of months of process, and they will give you your own branded preprint server for free. I have the same one for paleontology. At the moment, we call it PaleoArchive, very original. But yeah, if the technology is there at the moment, and there's a very big supportive community out there as well. Yeah, I don't get paid for that, by the way, so I'm okay to promote it.
A couple of questions linking to reviewers. So I'll start with the first one. At what level do you think a researcher, so an individual, may start to actually review? For instance, is their formal status as a PhD important?
This is an exceptionally interesting and important question. So I don't think there are any rules with this necessarily. So for example, F1000, they don't let you review unless you have a PhD. That's one of their requirements. And they got a lot of pushback on this because a PhD isn't necessarily a mark of expertise. However, you know, a little personal story for me, the first time I ever did a peer review was before I had ever published a paper. It was in the first year of my, or second year of my PhD, and it was for an Elsevier journal. I felt very dirty doing this, and I said, I don't want to do this review because I don't feel I have enough expertise in this. And the editor said, no, you know, I'm nominating you as an expert to do this. And I was like, I don't feel comfortable doing it. And they're like, go on, and essentially pressurized me into doing it. And I felt very uncomfortable doing it as I didn't feel my expertise was big enough, or high enough, sorry. So what I did was I emailed my supervisor at the time, and I said, hey, Phil, you know, is this a good peer review report? And he said, surprisingly, actually, yes, it is, well done. And then we went from there. But that was what worked for me. You know, you might have a different sort of view of your own expertise. You know, it's up to you to make a decision. I would say that if you feel uncertain about accepting a request to do a peer review, then I would speak with someone who can guide you through the process. I don't want to like apply blanket rules to this. So, for example, speak to your supervisor. They'll hopefully know you pretty well, and hopefully they know peer review pretty well. Otherwise, why are they your supervisor? And they should be able to guide you through this process.
Okay, then a few comments again, all tied to the reviewing. So a negative thing for me personally is that the choice of reviewers for an article is often like gambling. You can get constructive reviewers, or you can face reviewers which are not in a good mood, or are very critical, or perhaps even nasty. And sometimes in my field, and this is engineering, evaluating article is dependent on mood. So, you know, tying to this, then we have a question on: do you think that reviewers should be anonymous, especially when it comes to early career researchers? So, for instance, I receive papers to review that are obviously by some high-standing scholar, could be a full professor or a specialist in the field, and I would be very hesitant to publish my name on the review because they can have consequences for my career, or I can even end up working for this individual. So, to what extent should anonymity be allowed, and to what extent could we cut out this kind of gambling nature of picking reviewers?
So yeah, those are two, again, really, really great questions. And I don't have an answer to them particularly, again. So this issue of early career researchers potentially being put at risk for signing a review, I don't think that someone should ever be put in a position where they are forced to become identified if they feel it's going to put them in a position of risk. And again, this is not down to me or to anyone else to say what should be done. This is up to journals and communities to figure out what works best for them. And also to recognize that this fear that we have, that by doing a good critical job during a review process is going to be punished, I think actually reveals a much more systemic issue that we have in the fact that we allow, senior researchers to get away with bad behavior at the cost of junior researchers. And this has been an ongoing discussion now for 2 years, and I keep asking, when are we going to have a support system in place for early career researchers, which is going to provide them with support to not feel like doing their job is going to cost them their job, essentially, or doing their job well, I guess. So I would say the best thing which journals can do is provide a sort of opt-out or opt-in scenario where we say, look, this is the policy, but if you're not comfortable with revealing yourself, that's totally fine. And they allow you to opt out of that process. Or alternatively, they can do it the other way around, where they say, if you are comfortable revealing yourself, then please do. Often, again, it depends again on how much value you put in a name. It also depends on whether or not you want to get recognition for your work. So, if I spend a whole day doing a review and, painstakingly going through someone's whole manuscript, I want them to know that it was me. It's like, yeah, I want credit for this in like a little bit. And you don't get that, sadly, if you're anonymous. So it's this whole sort of complicated mess of potential risks versus potential benefits. And again, this is up for individuals to weigh. I don't want to provide rules, but the most important thing is if you don't feel comfortable revealing your name, then don't do it. Speak to the editor of the journal or speak to your supervisor again and figure out a way to make it work. So what was it Gareth said, be as open as possible, but close as necessary is very important. And, in a culture where doing a good peer review is still something which can be penalized for, I think we have to sort of play it safe rather than play it risky.
So you would allow an opt-out, Jon, just so I get that. You say an opt-out should be allowed there.
I think so, yeah. Because as well as that, if the rule cannot be changed, if you say you must review yourself and you're made aware of that before you accept or reject the request to review, it can be very off-putting. So again, I think research has shown that if you are forced to reveal yourself, I say research, some little bits of research have shown that if you are forced to identify yourself during the review process, then it leads to an increase in the number of people turning down these requests to review because they're just not comfortable with it. So having an opt-out process is a really sort of smart way to find a middle ground there until we manage to fix these bigger sort of cultural issues.
And just a comment before I go back to the second part of that question. Comment is, I guess if reviews and reviewers were shared openly, could use for early career research. So seniors could help train with their reviews, and then openly could contact them. They could help train early career researchers to review properly. Yeah,
absolutely. So this is something again which is becoming a lot more common over the last few years. So when you submit a review report to a journal, it will say, has anybody helped you with this process, or did you co-author this review with anyone? And you can say, yeah, I did. I did it with my supervisor, or I did it with Gareth, or I did it with Jon, or I did it with Santa Claus, whatever it is you want. And yeah, that's sort of becoming more common these days. Again, like the fact is that 2 sets of eyes on a review are more powerful than 1. So everyone sort of wins in this case again. Gareth, you've frozen pretty bad here.
And then coming back, I'll give it a second. I think the net goes up and down.
Just it's a bit fragmented.
Try it again now. And again.
That's better.
Okay, we're back in again. So come back to the second part of that then. How to kind of select good reviewers. I mean, that's an open question, right? Editorial board, I guess that's their job. But if there's not an editorial board, if it's an open review system where you just apply, any ideas about that?
Yeah, sort of. So there are several different points to pick apart here. So I like the comment about traditional review is sort of like a Russian roulette. You never know who you're going to get. And it's just basically 1 or 2 people, maybe 3 in your field potentially, who provide some sort of review of your work, and that depends whether or not it gets published. It's a little bit sort of non-scientific in a lot of ways. What you can do though within that sort of traditional process, or the way things are moving at the moment, is you can nominate reviewers who you feel who you don't have a conflict of interest with, who you feel are competent enough to give a constructive and thorough review. And you can also, now you do this at the point of journal submission often these days. You can say, I want reviewer X, Y, and Z as potential candidates for reviewing this paper. And you can also do the inverse. If you know that someone is going to treat you unfairly, and they have done historically, if you think someone's going to be essentially badly behaved during the process, you can do that. And again, we've done that before in our history. We know that there are authors out there who looked very unfavorably upon the research that we were doing, not necessarily because they disagreed with it. They were just very aggressive because it was in conflict with their beliefs, and they made it very difficult for our articles to pass peer review. So what we used to do was to simply say, hey, this person has given us some very unfair reviews in the past. Can you make sure that you don't accidentally or deliberately invite them to review this process? Now, the idea, though, of opening it up for participation, you can combine this with the traditional process at the moment. And this depends, again, on whether or not you are comfortable exposing your work to open participatory review while it either undergoes a formal review process or beforehand. So a little story at the moment. Again, we have an article which we have shared as a preprint on PeerJ preprints at the moment. And on the commenting system there, and on Twitter, and on Facebook, and by email, we have now had, I don't know, maybe 30 people offering constructive comments on that preprint as it undergoes formal peer review at a normal journal. So, for the most part, these comments have been incredibly productive. Some people have, been very badly behaved in commenting, just saying, this is nonsense. But then you can just ignore them. People know who these people are. And yeah, like the fact is that it's exposed. It's actually very interesting. So if somebody does badly behave, then they essentially get pushed back. So we had a couple of commenters, for example, on Twitter in this case, who basically just said, this preprint is just nonsense. And everyone was like, okay, we went through it very carefully. We're like, okay, can you show us which bits you have problems with? And it was like, the whole thing is rubbish. We're like, okay, but could you tell us where we went wrong? It's like, no, you've just written nonsense. This is the exact problem with preprints. And then they blocked us in the end for simply trying to engage with civility with them. The thing is, they only compromised their own reputation in this case and came across like fools, because there is a community out there who is incredibly supportive of doing these things professionally, doing them with civility, and you can actually weed out and begin to fight or push back against these more nefarious sort of characters in this space. And this was all while it was undergoing the traditional process at this journal. Again, every process won't work like that. It depends on the community that you're part of. It depends on what you're submitting. It's all down to personal choice. The fact is, though, that by opening up yourself to review or wider participation and wider engagement, you do open yourself up to wider criticism. It depends on whether or not you want to treat these things as like a character building exercise or not, I guess, in some respects. But yeah, it really depends on what is best for you and your work, and what you, again, balancing benefits with potential risks. So in this case, for me, the benefits were outstanding compared to just a couple of people being losers. And I'm pretty happy with that. And that's a common experience actually with myself in preprinting.
So it is actually, when you open up peer review, there is a parallel in a way with the likes of Twitter, where because people now have the opportunity to comment openly on early drafts, they can also be nasty, right? But again, then we should know who these individuals are if they're being nasty, for instance.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Again, like, it's this double-edged sword. So, anyone who's ever gone to the comment section of Reddit or YouTube or whatever will know that people use anonymity to essentially be aggressive and rude and just generally not very nice people. And it's the same when it comes to peer review. people sometimes hide behind the anonymous veil which they are granted to attack your work very aggressively. And sometimes sunlight is the best disinfectant in these cases. But again, providing a blanket policy for identification to weed out these bad characters should not be put in place if it also compromises the potential for early career researchers to do their work properly, right? So again, this is the whole thing, like, there is no one size fits all. It's actually up to individuals to understand this process well enough so that they can make informed decisions about what is best for them. And I think what we're seeing is like the needle tipping towards openness is getting better. This attitudes to peer review survey show that things are getting a little bit more towards that. But it goes back to this point again. We have to have appropriate support frameworks in place that don't compromise junior researchers, because that's just terrible. And not just early career researchers, but other marginalized demographics coming into the space as well. So
yeah. Well, I guess a relatively simple question, but it's going to lead up to the next question. Could you explain what a mega journal is?
Yeah, for sure. So a mega journal, it's not like Optimus Prime or anything like that. A mega journal is something like, if you've heard of PeerJ or PLOS ONE, they tend to be cross-disciplinary journals that operate. The key difference between a mega journal, there are two key differences, I guess. First is that they tend to be extremely cross-disciplinary. The second thing is that the request is that when you perform a peer review for them, it is not based on things such as fit for the journal, which is irrelevant anyway, perceived future impact, perceived novelty, perceived sexiness of the research. They ask you to do one thing: to review the work based on whether it is scientifically credible and scientifically sound. So what we think peer review should be, right? And that's it. So if you submit work to a mega journal, irrespective of whether or not you have pretty results or sexy results, or you've confirmed your hypotheses and all of these things, none of that matters. It's, did you do good science? And then if the answer is yes, it's accepted.
Yeah, so basically this means that research that passes the quality criteria, only quality, this is good research, can get published, whether it's negative results or replication results, or I'd say this, not so novel or interesting or sexy research.
Sure. I mean, it's actually really handy for early career researchers. So, for example, if you're 2.5 years into your PhD and you finally gathering all of your results and you're like, shit, it doesn't produce a nice painted picture. There's no structural narrative to it. That doesn't matter. The fact is, now there are venues and these venues actually tend to be high impact. They have a high impact factor, if that still matters to you, where you can communicate that work irrespective of whether or not it tells a nice story. It's just like, yeah, hey, look, I spent the last 2 years doing this work and I can still get a paper out of it, even if it's not the most groundbreaking thing ever, which is actually what science should be anyway, right? Not every, the way in which we often communicate research is that every paper is a eureka moment. And that's just not really how it works. So mega journals are sort of pushing communication and review back towards reality in a way.
Yeah, it sets people up to fail research and career when research maybe doesn't work out as you wanted to, or you come up with negative results. It's still research. It should be published. It shouldn't be gate walls or not published. Question: this is a bit of a tough one. So, what do you think is the main obstacle for moving all open-minded journals to systems like F1000?
Holy mother of, how much time do we have? That's a really good question. So thanks to whoever asked that. You asked that one, didn't you?
No, it wasn't me.
What's the biggest obstacle? So there are a number of obstacles here. The first is that some journals are inherently resistant to change. So, for example, some of the highest impact ones, such as Nature and Science and the New England Journal of Medicine and Cell, it is highly unlikely that their deeply established peer review boards and editorial boards, will ever want to move to a system of increased openness, because this could potentially compromise their legitimacy in some ways. The second is that, again, we often just don't have a lot of data on whether these things are better or not. So ironically, one of the best publishers in this space is actually Elsevier. So Elsevier have recently done a huge, probably one of the biggest surveys on the efficacy of the different elements of open peer review to see if, based on a pilot with a number of their journals, if it's worth rolling out these different elements of openness across the board at Elsevier. And it turns out, actually, the data are pretty good. And Elsevier are one of the most progressive open peer review publishers out there now. I know, a sentence I never thought I would say. However, they are still going to do it within the constraints of their sort of present structure. They're not going to do, they're not going to start saying, oh yeah, we now encourage every single submission to be a preprint with decoupled peer review, because that would compromise the need for their journals, I guess, in many ways. So progress will always be slow. The third one is that a lot of journals will say we will only do what is in the best interests of our community of authors and reviewers. And if there is no push from that community to adopt more open practices, then they are simply just not going to do it. I guess they're the three main ones, right?
Yeah, and maybe last question, coming back to the rewards. Especially two things: engage in doing open peer reviews themselves, and then put their articles in open peer review systems. How could you actually reward that?
You turn into a half robot then. Again, I could barely hear you. Sorry, could you repeat?
One second.
I really want to screenshot the face which you've pulled at the moment. It's outrageous.
And I'll try again.
Yes,
Can you hear me now?
Just about, but you've frozen still.
I apologize. I think the net goes in and out and the links go up and down here. So last question about rewards. So, how, and it can be anything you think of, how could we reward researchers, especially early career researchers, to not only submit their articles to be openly peer reviewed, but to themselves do open peer review? So
that's another really great question. It's like, reward means a lot of different things to people. Like, do we mean reward in terms of just recognition? Do we mean reward in terms of like monetary, what's the word, compensation? Do you mean, reward means a lot, like reward in terms of getting recognition for jobs and grants and hiring and all of this sort of thing? The best sort of thing, like one of my favorite platforms out there is actually owned by Clarivate Analytics, and it's called Publons, right? And what you can do is, every time you've written a review report, you can basically create a profile, a peer reviewer profile around this within Publons, and keep a fully documented record of your review activity. And a lot of the times they allow you to expose that review report for inspection and feedback from the wider community. And if you have an ORCID profile, which hopefully Gareth has made you all get, then Publons automatically integrates with them. And now, as well, across an increasingly big number of journals, you will be given the chance. So when you submit your report, it will say, hey, look, this journal has partnered with Publons. Do you want to port the data immediately, automatically over there for you? So there's like this sort of automated credit and recognition system coming into place at the moment. Getting that recognized at different levels, still very uncertain at the moment. You might be going for a job where somebody might say, hey, look, this person has a really good review record. You might go for another person on that committee might say, yeah, but we don't care. Again, it's all very subjective at the moment. What I like to think is that if you can demonstrate that you are doing good reviews for good journals in your field, then it will give you an edge over someone who perhaps isn't making that public. But again, it really, really, really depends. But the point is, there are ways for, if you wish to get more credit for your reviews, you can do them. If you don't, however, like Publons, because they're owned by the same dudes who operate the impact factor, you can also just upload them to Zenodo. You can create a GitHub repo with just these sort of details in there. It'll be unverified, but it's something to point to. Yeah.
And Jon, could you tell us a bit more about the Open Science MOOC? What's the idea behind it, and how does it work?
Yeah, so the Open Science MOOC, so MOOC in this case stands for MOOC, stands for Massively Open Online Community, which is a little bit different from what it normally means of Massively Open Online Course. And the whole idea is that we're creating a modular-based peer-to-peer learning community of practice around all of the different elements to do with peer review. So Gareth showed that little image earlier about, I think, the 9 different elements of peer review, including things like open evaluation and peer review, open access, open data, open source, blah, blah, blah. And we also include training modules on things like citizen science, public engagement with science. And the next one we're about to release is on open principles, so people can actually figure out what are the sort of values and principles that have underlying the history and culture of the open movement, which is kind of cool, I think. And the whole idea is that it's very low barriers to entry. You learn really cool new skills. You get to meet really cool people. We produce high quality sort of training resources like videos and whatever. And yeah, it's like this really sort of vibrant community where we take little steps towards openness. We break things down very incrementally at the moment. So at the moment, we have a first module has been live now for about 3 months, teaching people how to inject more of a sort of open source workflow into their research using software such as Git and Zenodo for greater archiving. The whole idea is that you learn new knowledge to transform your understanding of the scientific ecosystem and new skills to increase the efficiency and collaborative sort of nature of your own work. And we bear in mind that, you know, this is all about how to make researchers use their time better to solve the problems that they have for their own benefit, as well as the benefit of the wider research community and ultimately the wider public. So come join us, we're cool.
Thanks, Jon, that's quite clear. Last minute or two for a very final statement from you, or maybe some tips for early career researchers regarding open peer review.
Sure. So like I said, the best thing to do is take this step by step and speak with your supervisors or me and Gareth if you have questions about this stuff. There's a really great community. If you're confused as well, you can join like our Slack channel, and we have dozens of experts in open peer review as part of that. And yeah, I guess if you have questions, then ask someone. There is a lot of really great research out there, so I've added a lot of further reading. One of the most important things we can do in this sort of rapidly evolving space is make sure that we are well informed of the research and the options that are available to us. You know, this idea that research peer review, is not a singular process. It has not always been this way. It is subject to change. It is a very diverse process, and just sort of being mindful of that can be very effective for empowering ourselves within this space. If you want to practice doing open peer review, there are sort of a lot of opportunities out there for you. You can go on to platforms like PubPeer and offer comments. You can go onto Science Open and you can offer a post-publication peer review there of any articles that you like. Yeah, I think that. Oh, and if you like, if you want to try annotating a preprint, you can go to the Open Science Framework, and they have a platform called Hypothesis inbuilt there, and you can leave inline comments on any preprints that you want, which is essentially just, you know, nice, simple peer review. Good places to get practice. Yeah, so that's my advice. Become informed, speak to people if you have problems, and practice, practice, practice.
Thanks, Jon. I'm going to wrap this up. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks for being willing to give the webinar and answer questions afterwards. So this is the 4th of our webinars. We have some more coming. We will be looking at open licensing. We will be looking at fair data, how to implement the data management plan and fair data. We will also be looking at open access and particularly Plan S, and we will also be looking at open source. So I'll say goodbye to you all. Apologies this time for the net connection. It seems to go up a little bit up and down, but I hope you're able to follow. And we will see you all again in the next webinar, which will be soon. So have a good day and good luck.
Everyone. Take it easy.
Thanks again, Jon.